The wound doesn't scream. It arrives in the dark and stays as a low, endless hum, the sound of a mind trying to make sense of a world that no longer sends it any light. Rowan Voss lay on top of the hospital sheets, rather than beneath them, as if some old instinct still refused to let him be trapped by anything, even cotton. The room held the particular quiet of 4 a.m., the hour when machines speak more than people do, the soft mechanical inhale of the ventilator 2 beds down, the far-off squeak of a gurney wheel needing oil, the drip that fell into its little plastic reservoir every 4 seconds, exact as a metronome counting down to nothing. He could not see any of it. That was the first fact of his new life, the one his mind returned to first every morning before memory could offer him anything gentler. There had been an explosion of light once, so much light that his optic nerve had simply refused to process it anymore, and in exchange the world had given him this, a permanent, textured darkness, not black exactly, more like a television tuned to a dead channel, gray static breathing at the edges of everything. The hearing was worse in some ways because it worked well enough to torment him, muffled, submerged, as though he were always underwater in a pool that had once been full of gunfire. His left hand moved before his brain gave the order. It always did this. The fingers curled inward, found nothing, closed anyway around the empty air where a leather lead should have sat, warm and worn smooth by years of use. The knuckles went white with the pressure of gripping something that did not exist. A nurse walking past. He could tell by the rhythm of her shoes, quick, competent, unbothered, would have seen only a man clenching his fist in his sleep. She would not have known that the hand remembered a weight the rest of him refused to let go of, the weight of a line that used to run from his palm to a dog who was, at that exact moment, breathing 11 feet away, forbidden by policy from doing anything but existing in that exact spot. Dagger lay pressed into the corner beside the window, a shape most of the staff had stopped acknowledging by the 3rd day, the way you stop seeing a chair you've walked past 100 times. He did not sleep so much as monitor sleep, ears rotating independently toward each new sound the hallway offered, body coiled with a stillness that looked like calm and was, in fact, its opposite, a readiness that had nowhere left to be useful. The scar along his left flank, hairless and pale beneath the dark brindle coat, caught what little light came through the blinds and turned it faintly silver. He had not chosen this room. He had not chosen this stillness. He had been trained, once, for motion with purpose, the controlled explosion of a body sent forward on command, sent to find, to hold, to protect. Now there was only the corner, and the man on the bed whose scent had changed since the injury, gone sour with the particular chemical fear sweat of someone who has stopped trusting his own senses. A voice came from the doorway, low, meant for a colleague and not for the room. That dog really needs to go to a kennel service. Liability, mostly. He growled at Dietrich again yesterday. A second voice, softer, non-committal, the kind that agrees without agreeing. Rowan heard every word with a clarity his eyes would never again offer him, and something in his chest folded a little further inward, the way paper folds when it has already been folded too many times and the crease no longer holds cleanly. He said nothing. He had learned, in the 11 months since the light took his sight and left him this hum instead, that arguing on behalf of a dog who could not argue for himself was its own kind of exhausting, and exhaustion was the one resource he could no longer afford to spend. He thought, not for the first time, that he had survived the wrong version of himself, the version that led men through buildings that wanted to kill them, The version whose hand on a leash meant something, meant forward, meant I have you, keep going. That man had died somewhere in the white noise of the blast, and what had woken up in this bed was someone else wearing his name, a man who could not see his own son's face, could not read a room, could not even be trusted, apparently, to keep a decorated working dog from being labeled a liability. The guilt arrived the way it always did, uninvited and total. The faces of the two men who had not made it out of that building, faces he could still see with perfect clarity, because they belonged to the version of him that still had eyes, filed away in some part of memory that trauma had, cruelly, left untouched. Down the hall, a door opened. Small footsteps, quick and light, sneaker soles against linoleum, moving with the particular urgency of someone who has waited all day for visiting hours and has now run out of patience for walking properly. Dagger's head lifted a fraction of an inch off his paws. His tail did not wag. It had not wagged in this building yet. But his ears angled fully forward, and a low sound rose in his chest that was not quite a whine and not quite anything Rowan had a name for. Rowan's ruined hand loosened, just slightly, around the ghost of the leash he was still holding. "Dad?" Ethan's voice cracked the silence open, like a small, careful hand, prying apart something that had been sealed shut for 11 months. And in the dark that never lifted, Rowan turned his face toward the sound of his son, the only direction left in the world that still felt like coming home. Claire Bennett had a rule she never wrote down anywhere, not in her charts, not in her head even, not really. She simply lived by it the way some people live by a compass they can't explain having. If it moves you, and it isn't hurting anyone, let it stay. It was this rule, more than any hospital bylaw, that had kept Dagger in that corner of room 214 for 11 days, when 3 separate memos had already suggested otherwise. She had read the memos. She had signed nothing. She came in that morning, the way she came in every morning, tray balanced against her hip, the particular brisk cheer of someone who has trained her voice to sound lighter than she feels, because patients listen to tone before they listen to words. "Morning, Sergeant," she said, not because Rowan had asked to be called that, but because she'd noticed, weeks ago, how his shoulders settled half an inch when she used it. Some old muscle memory of rank and respect, finding its footing even in a body that had lost so much else. Dagger's eyes tracked her across the room without his head moving, a habit she'd come to find almost companionable rather than unsettling, the way you get used to being watched by something that has decided, eventually, that you are not a threat. It was Ethan who had done the real work of that decision, in the end. Claire remembered the first time she'd seen the boy crouch down in front of the dog, not the careful sideways approach adults used, hand out, waiting for permission, but a full, unthinking drop to the floor, forehead nearly touching Dagger's, the particular fearlessness of a child who has not yet learned that scarred things can be dangerous. Dagger had not moved, had, if anything, leaned the smallest fraction of an inch into the boy's small hands, and Claire had stood in the doorway with a chart she suddenly had no urge to finish filling out, watching something in the room's grief loosen just slightly, like a stitch finally given room to breathe. She had gone to her supervisor that same afternoon, not with a request exactly, more with a decision already made and dressed up as a question. Therapy animal precedent, veteran patient, isolation risk, documented anxiety symptoms improved by the animal's presence. She had used every clinical word she had, because clinical words were the only currency that moved anything in this building, and underneath all of them was the much simpler truth, the one she didn't put in the request. that she had seen a man's clenched fist relax for the first time in a week, and she was not going to be the reason it closed again. Now, 3 weeks into an arrangement nobody had fully approved, and nobody had fully challenged either, Claire had begun to notice something else, something smaller, something that lived in the margins of her rounds the way the most important things usually did. Ethan visited every day after school, satchel still on his shoulders half the time, cheeks still flushed from whatever version of running 8-year-olds did in hospital corridors when they thought no one was watching. And every day, without fail, in the last 30 seconds before he left his father's room, the boy would climb up onto the bed rail, put his mouth close to Claire's ear if she happened to be nearby, and if she wasn't, he would find her, would trot down the hall and tug her sleeve until she bent down, and he would whisper something. Always quiet, always quick. Always gone again before she could fully process it, folded back into the ordinary business of a child saying goodbye to his father. She had assumed, the first few times, that it was nothing, the private mythology children build, a secret password, a game he and his father had invented before the accident to make hospital visits feel less like hospital visits. She had smiled and nodded and gone back to her chart. But she was a nurse who had spent 9 years learning to notice the difference between a child's imagination and a child's fear, and lately, when she let herself actually listen instead of simply hearing, the whispers had begun to sound less like a game and more like a boy handing her something heavy that he did not know how to carry by himself. She hadn't caught the words yet, not clearly. Just fragments, the way you catch pieces of a radio station that keeps drifting out of range. He, when you're not, hurts, before Ethan would pull back, satisfied, as if the transfer had been completed, and skip off toward the elevators with his backpack bouncing against his spine, leaving Claire standing very still in the hallway with an unease she couldn't yet name and didn't know what to do with. It was Marcus Whitfield's footsteps, ironically, that gave her the next piece, though she wouldn't understand its significance for days yet. He came through the door of 214 that afternoon, with his usual unhurried competence, clipboard tucked under one arm, already reaching for the IV line before he'd fully cleared the threshold, and Dagger came up off the floor in one motion. No warning growl, no easing into it, just a full and instant transformation, from resting animal to something coiled and vigilant, the fur along his shoulders and neck rising in a stiff ridge that Claire had only ever seen once before, years ago, in a K9 demo at a county fair, when the handler had given the command for alert. "Easy," Rowan murmured toward the sound, his hand finding the edge of the mattress and gripping it instead of the leash that wasn't there. "Easy, boy." Whitfield didn't so much as glance at the dog. That was the thing Claire noticed, turning it over later that night when she couldn't sleep, lying in her own apartment with the television murmuring to no one. A room full of people would look at a 180-pound dog raising every hair on its body 4 feet away from them. Whitfield hadn't looked at Dagger even once. He'd simply continued adjusting the drip, unbothered, as though the reaction were a weather pattern he'd already checked the forecast for. Claire filed it away without knowing yet that it was a file. Some part of her, the part that had let a wounded dog stay in a hospital room against 3 memos worth of policy, was already keeping score. The chart is supposed to tell the truth. That was the first thing Claire had ever been taught, back in nursing school, in a professor's voice so certain it had felt like scripture at the time. The chart doesn't lie. People lie. The chart is just numbers, and numbers don't have motives. She had built 9 years of practice on that sentence. She was beginning, in the quiet hours of Rowan Voss's recovery, to understand what it had never told her, that numbers could be arranged by someone who did. She started keeping her own record, not officially, not in anything that would show up on a supervisor's desk. Just a small spiral notebook she kept in the outer pocket of her scrubs, the kind of notebook nurses use for shift change reminders, phone numbers, things too small to matter to anyone but the person writing them down. She told herself, the first time she wrote 0.4 milligrams increase, no order change logged in small, careful handwriting, that she was simply being thorough. She did not let herself examine, not yet, why thoroughness had suddenly acquired the texture of dread. The pattern, once she allowed herself to see it as a pattern rather than a string of coincidences, had a terrible simplicity to it. Rowan's morphine dosage, which had been stepping down steadily for 2 weeks, the ordinary, hopeful trajectory of a body healing on schedule, had begun, in the last several days, to plateau in a way that didn't match his other vitals. His oxygen saturation was good. His wound sites, according to Dr. Ferris's last note, were closing well. By every objective measure that mattered, Rowan Voss should have been sleeping less, not more, should have been requesting his pain medication with decreasing urgency, not increasing confusion about how much he'd already been given. And always, when Claire laid the timeline out flat in her mind, the way you lay out a hand of cards to see what game you're actually playing, the drop came after Whitfield's rounds. She noticed it first in small things, the kind of details that on their own meant nothing and together meant everything. Rowan's speech, crisp and deliberate in the mornings, the careful enunciation of a man compensating for blindness by making sure his words did the work his eyes no longer could. That same speech, by 4 in the afternoon, on the days Whitfield covered the ward, would soften at the edges, slur very slightly, the sentences losing their scaffolding halfway through. He'd start, then stop, frowning at a thought that had slipped sideways out of his reach. Once she found him, with his hand still curled around the untouched lunch tray, food gone cold, as though he'd simply lost the thread of eating partway through the act. "You seem tired today, Sergeant," she said once, keeping her voice light, watching his face for whatever it might involuntarily tell her. "I keep losing time," he admitted, and something about the way he said it, not alarmed, just resigned. A man who had already decided his own mind was one more casualty he wasn't allowed to argue with, made her chest tighten in a way she didn't have a clinical word for. She began arriving earlier for her shifts, leaving later, finding reasons to be in the hallway outside 214 during the overlap windows when Whitfield's rounds crossed her own. She watched him work with the specific, exhausting attention of someone pretending not to watch at all, refilling supply carts 3 doors down, restocking gauze she didn't need, anything that let her keep the doorway of room 214 in the corner of her eye without appearing to. Dagger gave her the clearest data of all, though it took her longer than it should have to trust an animal's judgment over a colleague's credentials. The dog ate on a schedule as fixed as the hospital's own. The aide brought his bowl at 6 and again at 5, and in 3 weeks Claire had never once seen him leave food in it, not with the disciplined, almost military tidiness of an animal that had spent years being fed on command and had never learned to waste anything. But on the days Whitfield's shift overlapped with feeding time, the bowl sat untouched. Dagger would rise, cross to it, lower his head as if beginning the motion out of habit alone, and then simply stop, ears swiveling toward the door, body angling itself between the food and whatever hallway sound had caught his attention, as though eating itself had become a luxury he couldn't afford until the room was safe again. She mentioned it once, carefully, to the aide who fed him. "Is he not eating on Whitfield's days?" The aide, a heavy-set young man named Toby who liked dogs more than he liked most of the nursing staff, shrugged without much interest. Dogs get funny moods sometimes. Maybe he doesn't like the smell of his cologne or something. He laughed a little at his own joke and went back to his cart, and Claire laughed too. The automatic, deflecting laugh of someone keeping a colleague from asking why she was really curious. But she wrote it down anyway, that night, in the little spiral notebook, in the same careful hand. Dog will not eat when MW present. 3R, D occurrence. She didn't yet have a shape for what she was assembling. She had a dosage chart that didn't track with recovery. She had a decorated combat veteran losing hours of his own afternoons to a fog no doctor had ordered. She had a dog, trained, disciplined, formerly entrusted with the kind of judgment the military doesn't hand out lightly, refusing food as if refusing were the only protest available to him. And she had a boy who kept pressing his mouth to her ear at the end of every visit, offering her some fragment she still hadn't fully caught. Alone, none of it was anything. Together, it sat in her chest, like a held breath she didn't know yet how to release. And that night, walking to her car under a sky gone the flat gray of an early winter dusk, Claire found herself doing something she had never done in 9 years of nursing. She looked back over her shoulder at the building before she got in, checking, without entirely knowing what for, whether anyone had followed her out. Thursday came in gray and ordinary, the kind of afternoon that gives no warning at all for the thing it's about to carry. Claire remembered, later, how unremarkable it had felt in the first 60 seconds. The same squeak of sneakers down the corridor, the same backpack straps digging twin grooves into small shoulders, the same breathless high Miss Claire tossed over one shoulder, as Ethan pushed through the door of 214, like a boy arriving somewhere that still, despite everything, felt a little bit like the best part of his day. She was at the med cart 3 doors down, counting out the evening rotation with the automatic precision of muscle memory, when she heard him laughing at something his father had said. Rowan's voice pitched low and warm, in a way it rarely was for anyone but his son, a register that seemed to reach backward into some version of the man that existed before the light took everything from him. Dagger's tail, Claire would learn later from Rowan himself, had thumped twice against the floor, which for Dagger was practically a parade. 40 minutes. That was how long visiting hours allowed on weekdays, and Ethan spent every one of them the way he always did, narrating his day in the specific, unedited detail only an 8-year-old can manage, a substitute teacher's unfair math homework, a friend named Cody who had eaten a crayon on a dare, the particular injustice of being assigned green beans at lunch 2 days in a row. Rowan listened to all of it, with his face turned toward the sound of his son's voice. And Claire, passing the doorway with a tray of someone else's medications, found herself slowing down without quite deciding to. The way you slow down near a fire on a cold day without admitting that's what you're doing. Then the intercom crackled, visiting hours, 5-minute warning, and something in the room's rhythm shifted, the small, practiced choreography of an ending neither of them liked. Ethan slid down off the bed rail, zipped his backpack though it hadn't been open, kissed his father's cheek with the quick, slightly embarrassed efficiency of a boy who had decided he was getting too old for it, but hadn't quite managed to stop. Love you, Dad. Love you too, bud. Same time tomorrow. And then, exactly as he had every single day for 3 weeks, Ethan turned and found Claire in the hallway. She was there. She was always somehow there in that window, though she would later wonder if some part of her had simply learned his schedule the way you learn the schedule of a bus you need to catch. He crossed to her with the particular urgency he always had in those final seconds, tugged once at the hem of her scrub top to bring her down to his height, and cupped one small hand around his mouth the way children do when a thing feels important enough to need a wall against the world. Claire bent down out of pure habit, already half composing the smile she'd give him before he darted off toward the elevators, already half thinking about the next room on her rounds. The words arrived close and warm against her ear, unhurried this time, each one distinct, as if the boy had finally decided the message needed to land whole, instead of in the fragments she'd only ever caught before. "He hurts Dad when you leave." 5 words, that was all. Ethan pulled back before she could react, and for one suspended second, his face held an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Not fear exactly, not the wide-eyed drama of a child telling a ghost story for effect, but something flatter and more exhausted than that, the particular weariness of someone who has been trying to say a true thing for a long time and has just now, finally, managed to say it clearly enough that it might be heard. Then it was gone. He blinked, and the ordinary 8-year-old resurfaced over it, like water closing over a stone, and he grinned at her, actually grinned, bright and unbothered, and said, "Bye, Miss Claire," and jogged off down the hallway toward the elevator bank where his mother was waiting, backpack thumping against his spine, sneakers squeaking their familiar rhythm against the linoleum, a boy who had just handed a grown woman the heaviest thing he owned and walked away lighter for it. Claire did not move for a long moment. The hallway around her continued exactly as it had, a gurney wheel somewhere, the distant chime of a call button, a colleague's laugh from the nurse's station, but something in her own chest had gone very still, the stillness of a held breath, the stillness of a person standing at the exact center of a floor she has just realized might not be as solid as she thought. He hurts Dad when you leave. Not a nightmare, not a game, not the private mythology of a child working through an unfamiliar hospital the way children work through anything frightening, by wrapping it in metaphor until it's small enough to hold. This was a sentence with a subject and a verb and a timeline, spoken in the specific, deliberate cadence of a boy, repeating something he had watched with his own eyes and had been carrying, alone, because he hadn't yet found the right person, or the right moment, or the right amount of courage to say it whole. He, not a nightmare, not a monster under a hospital bed, a he, a person, someone with a name, a face, a badge clipped to a lanyard, someone who walked these halls in daylight and nobody questioned. When you leave, Claire looked down the corridor toward room 214, where through the half-open door she could just see the edge of Rowan's bed, his hand resting slack against the sheet, Dagger's silhouette rising slowly to check the doorway the way he always did when a shift in the room's air told him something had changed, even if he couldn't say what. She thought of the dosage chart in her spiral notebook. She thought of the untouched food bowl. She thought of 180 pounds of trained protection instinct, raising its hackles at a man nobody else in this building had ever once looked at twice. She straightened her spine, tucked the tray of medications back into the crook of her arm, with hands that were, she noticed distantly, no longer quite steady, and walked back toward the nurse's station with the beginning of a decision already taking root in her chest. Quiet, certain, and entirely her own. Whatever was happening in that room, she was done waiting for proof to arrive on its own. The trouble with certainty, Claire discovered over the following 2 days, was that it did not survive contact with paperwork. She sat in the break room that first night after her shift ended, the overhead fluorescents humming their thin institutional hum, Rowan's full chart open on the laptop in front of her, and she made herself read it the way she would have read any other patient's file, clinically, skeptically, the way 9 years of training had taught her to read anything a family member insisted was wrong before the numbers agreed. The numbers, infuriatingly, mostly agreed with normal. Whitfield's notes were meticulous. That was the first thing that unsettled her, more than any anomaly could have. The sheer, orderly competence of them. Medication times logged to the minute. Dosages that fell, on paper, within acceptable ranges, each one cross-referenced against the standing orders Dr. Ferris had written weeks ago and never formally revised. There was no smoking gun anywhere in the file, no glaring error a review board would flag in an afternoon. If she printed this chart and handed it to her supervisor and said something is wrong here, she would be handing over a stack of paper that, to any objective eye, documented a hospital doing exactly what a hospital is supposed to do. She closed the laptop and sat with her hands flat on the break room table, breathing in a way she recognized, distantly, as the same breathing she taught anxious family members to use in waiting rooms. In for 4, hold for 4, out for 4. It did not help as much as she told patients it would. "You're building a case out of a dog's appetite and a little boy's nightmare," said the voice in her head that sounded, uncomfortably, like the nursing school professor who'd taught her that charts didn't lie. "You have 9 years of experience telling you that anecdote is not evidence. What are you actually going to say if someone asks you to explain this? That the German Shepherd doesn't like his aftershave? Belgian Malinois," she corrected herself, automatically, and then almost laughed at the absurdity of correcting her own imagined skeptic on a taxonomic detail while the actual accusation sat there unanswered. This was the shape her nights had taken, these last 2 days. A kind of interior courtroom that convened every time she was alone, long enough for it to get a word in. Prosecution and defense trading places, without ever quite reaching a verdict. She would lie in bed replaying Ethan's face in that hallway, the specific flatness of his voice when he'd said, "He hurts Dad," a cadence too controlled, too deliberate, to belong to invention. And just as she'd feel the certainty solidifying in her chest, the other voice would arrive, patient and reasonable, and devastating. Children absorb fear from everywhere. A television left on too long. A frightening word overheard in a waiting room, and misapplied to the nearest adult male in uniform. You are a trained medical professional, about to accuse a colleague of a felony based on the testimony of an 8-year-old and a dog. The dog was, if anything, worse to argue with, because the dog offered no words to dissect, no phrasing to reinterpret more charitably. She had spent 3 nights now finding excuses to be near room 214 during the overlap window, and 3 nights running Dagger had done the same thing. The sudden vertical rise of hackles, the low, continuous thread of a growl too controlled to be random noise, the way his body angled itself, every time, into the narrow space between Whitfield and the bed, as if he were something built for exactly that purpose, and had simply been waiting, all this time, for the chance to use it. Animals didn't lie. Animals didn't absorb fear from television. But animals also weren't admissible anywhere that mattered, and she knew, with the flat, unhappy clarity of someone who had watched incident reports get dismissed before, exactly how it would sound if she tried to explain any of this to Dr. Ferris in daylight. The dog doesn't like him. She could already hear the pause that would follow. She could already see the careful, kind, professionally concerned expression that hospital administrators wore right before they suggested a colleague take some time off. And underneath both arguments, quieter than either of them, ran the current that frightened her most, the possibility that she was wrong, not because the evidence was thin, but because some part of her wanted it to be true. She had grown fond of that room in a way that had started, weeks ago, to feel like more than professional care. Fond of Rowan's dry, understated humor on his better days. Fond of the specific bravery of a boy who visited a hospital every afternoon without ever once complaining about it. Fond, even, of a scarred dog who had decided, against every instinct 11 months of neglect should have taught him, to trust her enough to eat from her hand once, when Toby was out sick. Was she building a conspiracy because the facts demanded it, or because some part of her simply couldn't bear the alternative explanation, that everything in that room really was fine, and she was about to blow up her own career chasing a shadow because she'd let herself care too much? She caught her own reflection in the break room window, the dark glass turning the fluorescent-lit room into a mirror against the night outside, and did not entirely recognize the tired, uncertain woman looking back at her. You could be wrong, she told herself, and made herself sit with that possibility fully, the way she'd once been taught to sit with a difficult diagnosis before delivering it to a family, not flinching from it, not softening it early. You could ruin a man's career and a family's trust in this hospital because a child said something ambiguous and a traumatized dog doesn't like a particular aftershave. But then, unbidden, the other memory surfaced. Not evidence exactly, just a fragment, small and sharp. Rowan 2 afternoons ago, mid-sentence, losing the thread of his own thought, the way a man loses his footing on ice, blinking hard, as if trying to physically locate himself again. I keep losing time, he'd said, not frightened, just resigned. A soldier who had already decided that his own mind, like his eyes, was simply one more thing this year had taken from him, and who had stopped expecting anyone to tell him otherwise. That resignation was the thing Claire couldn't argue herself out of, because resignation like that didn't belong to ordinary post-surgical fatigue. She had sat with enough recovering patients to know the difference between a body that was tired and a body that was being taken from, slowly, by someone else's hand, and some old, unteachable part of her, the part that had nothing to do with charts or dosage logs, recognized which one she was looking at. She sat alone in the break room until the clock ticked past 11, turning the argument over and over without ever quite letting either side win, until finally she reached for her phone. Not to call anyone, not yet. She wasn't ready for that, and opened the Notes app instead, and began typing, slowly, the outline of a plan that would require her to trust her instincts over her own hospital's paperwork for the first time in 9 years of doing exactly the opposite. If I'm wrong, she typed, I lose my job. If I'm right and I do nothing, I lose something I won't be able to live with. She read the sentence back once. Then she closed the laptop, gathered her coat, and walked out to her car with the particular exhausted resolve of a person who has stopped debating and started deciding. She did not tell anyone what she was planning, because there was nothing yet to tell that would survive being said out loud. Instead, on Friday, she did something smaller and stranger and entirely her own. She traded a shift. It took almost no effort in the end. Denise from the night rotation had been trying to swap out of a Friday for a cousin's wedding for 2 weeks, and Claire's offer, I'll cover it, no favor owed, was accepted with the easy gratitude of someone who had no idea what she was actually trading into. Claire signed her name on the schedule board in the break room and felt, doing it, the small, cold thrill of a decision that had stopped being hypothetical. She spent the hours before her shift doing something she'd never done in 9 years of nursing. She prepared like she was walking into something, rather than simply showing up for one. She charged her phone to full. She memorized without writing it down anywhere that could be found The exact sequence of the ward's silent alarm, the one meant for combative patients or violent visitors, the one that summoned security without alerting anyone in the room that it had been triggered. She checked, twice, that the door to 214 didn't stick the way the door to 211 did, because the last thing she needed tonight was a half-second of fumbling with a handle, and she looked, for a long moment before her shift began, at Dagger. He was lying in his usual corner when she came in for the overnight rounds, head up before she'd even finished pushing the door open, the specific alertness of an animal that had learned, in this room at least, to track every arrival as a potential variable. Claire crouched down in front of him the way she'd seen Ethan do it, dropping to his eye level instead of looming over him the way most adults instinctively did. "I need you to do the thing you keep doing," she said quietly, feeling faintly foolish and not caring. "Whatever it is you're doing, keep doing it." Dagger didn't respond, of course. There was no head tilt of comprehension, no movie dog moment of a creature visibly understanding English. But something in his stillness as he watched her felt less like indifference and more like attention, the particular quality of an animal that had spent years being trained to read human intention before human words ever caught up to it. And Claire found herself oddly steadied by it anyway, the way you're steadied by a colleague nodding along, even when they haven't said anything yet. Rowan, from the bed, turned his face toward the sound of her voice. "You're talking to my dog. I talk to all my patients' pets. It's very professional." "Sure it is," a ghost of the dry humor she'd grown fond of. Then, quieter, the sightless eyes narrowing slightly, the way they did when he was listening past the words to something underneath them. "You're here late tonight." Picked up a shift, a pause. Rowan had spent 11 months learning to read rooms with his ears the way he used to read them with his eyes, and Claire had the uncomfortable sense, not for the first time, that very little got past him regardless of what his medical chart claimed about his senses. "Claire, get some rest, Sergeant." He didn't push it. She was grateful for that, more than she let herself show, because she didn't yet have words she trusted to explain what she was doing, and she suspected that if she tried to give him half an explanation, his instincts, the old, unretired instincts of a man who used to walk into danger for a living, would have him arguing to be moved, to be told everything, to take some action his body could no longer safely perform. Better, for tonight, to let him rest inside the version of the evening that looked ordinary from where he lay. The hours between 8 and midnight passed the way ordinary hours pass, and Claire began, despite herself, to wonder if tonight would simply be a night like any other. Whitfield's shift didn't officially overlap with the late rotation, which meant if he came in at all, it would be outside his own scheduled hours, a detail she'd noticed only because she'd started noticing everything about his schedule. She refilled charts. She checked vitals 2 doors down. She kept finding reasons to pass the doorway of 214, and every single time, Dagger's eyes found her in the same half-second it took her to appear. Some small, silent confirmation exchanged between them that had nothing to do with words. It was 11:47 when she heard the elevator. She knew the sound of every elevator car in this wing by now, the particular groan the east one made on its final 6 inches before the doors opened, a sound she'd stopped consciously registering months ago, and now, tonight, heard with the total clarity of a person whose entire nervous system had gone on alert. Footsteps followed, unhurried, familiar in their rhythm in a way that made her stomach drop, before her mind had finished the identification. She knew that gait, the slight favor of the left foot, the particular economy of someone who had walked these halls so many times he no longer needed to think about where he was going. She stepped back from the doorway of 214 into the recessed alcove of the supply closet 3 feet away, close enough to see through the narrow gap of the door, but far enough, she hoped, that she wouldn't be the first thing he saw if he glanced up. Whitfield came around the corner and into the hallway with his clipboard tucked against his side, moving with the loose, unbothered confidence of a man walking into a room he'd walked into 100 times before without consequence. The reaction inside 214 began before he'd even crossed the threshold. Claire heard it, the low, rising register of a growl that hadn't waited for visual confirmation, that had come from scent alone, from footstep alone, some older and more precise warning system than sight would ever have offered. By the time Whitfield's shoulder cleared the doorframe, Dagger was already on his feet, already positioned at the foot of the bed, with his body forming a solid, immovable line between the door and the man lying in it, hackles risen in a stiff, continuous ridge, from skull to shoulder, teeth showing in a way she had not yet seen from him, not even on the worst of the previous nights. "Easy," Rowan murmured, half asleep, reaching a hand toward the sound, without knowing yet what had caused it. Whitfield stopped in the doorway. For the first time in 3 weeks of watching him, Claire saw something cross his face that wasn't practiced calm. A flicker, brief and quickly smoothed over, the look of a man recalculating. "Just here to check the line," he said, to the room in general, to no one in particular, already reaching one hand toward his badge as if the gesture alone should settle the matter. Dagger did not sit, did not stand down. The growl deepened, and he took one deliberate step forward, placing himself fully between Whitfield and the IV pole, and Claire, still and silent in the narrow dark of the supply closet, felt something in her chest settle into place with the cold, certain click of a lock finally finding its key. "He knows," she thought, watching the dog hold his ground against a grown man twice his own weight, with nothing but instinct and scar tissue to arm him. "He's known this whole time." She didn't move yet, not tonight. Whatever came next needed more than a hunch and a hackled dog to survive daylight. But standing there in the dark, watching Dagger refuse to yield an inch of ground between Whitfield and the man he'd chosen to guard, Claire understood, with total clarity, that she was no longer looking for proof that something was wrong. She was looking for the moment she could finally stop it. The supply closet smelled of latex and antiseptic, and the particular staleness of a space too small for its own door to close properly, and Claire stood in it for exactly as long as it took her pulse to stop hammering against her collarbone before she made herself move. Whitfield had backed out of 214 without checking the line at all. She'd watched him do it, watched the badge gesture die halfway through, watched him retreat down the corridor with the clipboard held slightly too tight against his ribs. And the moment the elevator doors closed behind him, she understood that whatever window she had just been given would not stay open long. She went to the nurse's station. The overnight charge nurse, a heavy-set woman named Priya, who trusted Claire enough not to ask questions when Claire said she needed 10 minutes with the med administration records, was 3 rooms away, doing rounds of her own, which left Claire alone with the terminal, and a silence so complete she could hear her own heartbeat in her ears. She pulled Rowan's chart. The screen loaded the way it always loaded, the same tired hospital software rendering the same gray rows of timestamps and initials, and Claire made herself slow down before she started reading, made herself breathe the way she'd taught 100 anxious families to breathe, because she knew, some old, careful part of her knew, that the difference between finding something and missing it entirely would come down to patience now, not urgency. She started 3 days back. Read every entry in order, the way you'd read a sentence rather than skimming for a single word inside it. Because she'd learned, over the last 4 nights of quiet obsession, that whatever was wrong here hid itself in the seams between entries, rather than inside any single one. The first pass gave her nothing. Every timestamp lined up with a corresponding initial. Every dosage sat inside the range Dr. Ferris had authorized weeks ago. She felt the familiar cold creep of doubt returning. You're seeing a pattern because you already believe it exists, and made herself go back to the beginning and read it a second time, slower, this time cross-referencing each medication entry against the physical inventory log the pharmacy kept separately, a document almost nobody bothered checking because it existed mostly for billing reconciliation rather than clinical review. It was there, on the second pass, in the gap between 2 documents that were never meant to be read side by side, that she found it. Tuesday, 9:47 p.m. Whitfield's initials beside a morphine administration, dosage within range, everything correct on the surface. But the pharmacy withdrawal log, the physical record of how much medication had actually left the locked cart, logged automatically by the cart's own scanner, a system Whitfield either didn't know existed or had assumed no one would think to check, showed a withdrawal quantity 11% higher than what the chart recorded as administered. 11%. Small enough to vanish inside rounding error if you weren't looking. Small enough that a single instance would mean nothing at all. Claire's hands had gone very still on the keyboard. She scrolled back further, cross-referencing every overlapping entry across both systems, and the gap wasn't a single instance. It repeated. Tuesday, Wednesday, Friday, this same night, before he'd ever reached Rowan's door, a withdrawal at 11:31 p.m., 16 minutes before he'd walked into 214, for a dosage the chart would later record as smaller than what had left the cart. The math wasn't complicated once she let herself do it plainly. Someone was withdrawing more medication than was being administered and logged, and the difference, whatever it was, wherever it was actually going, was landing somewhere the paperwork didn't follow. She sat back from the screen and became aware, distantly, that her breathing had changed, gone shallow and quick in a way she recognized from patients in the early stages of panic, and she made herself stop, made herself press both palms flat against the edge of the desk, the way she'd once been taught to ground herself during a mass casualty drill years ago. Facts first, feelings after. She wrote the discrepancies down, dates, times, quantities, in the same small spiral notebook that had, over the last 2 weeks, become something closer to evidence than she'd ever intended it to be. It was in the middle of this, hunched over the terminal with her notebook open beside the keyboard, that she thought back, unbidden, the way a detail surfaces only once you finally have somewhere to put it, to Whitfield's face in the doorway of 214 an hour earlier. She had been so focused on Dagger, on the dog's held ground and bared teeth, that she'd almost missed it. Almost. But some part of her had recorded it anyway, filed it without her permission, and now it surfaced whole. The half-second before Whitfield had reached for his badge, his eyes had gone not to Rowan, not to Dagger, but past them both, to the hallway behind Claire's hiding spot, held there for a beat longer than any glance checking for witnesses should reasonably need. Not a flinch, a check. The specific, practiced look of someone confirming whether a plan was still safe to continue, not someone startled by an unexpected growl. She thought of the word liability the nurse had used the very first week, discussing Dagger like an inconvenience to be scheduled around. She thought of 11%, repeated 3 times in 5 days, small enough to survive a routine audit, and large enough, over weeks, to keep a recovering man perpetually 1 step behind his own healing. She closed the chart, closed the pharmacy log, sat for a moment in the hollow, ringing quiet of the nurse's station, with her own pulse loud in her ears, and understood, with the flat clarity of a decision that no longer needed convincing, that she was no longer gathering evidence to satisfy her own doubt. She was gathering it because someone was going to need to believe her, and doubt was a luxury that belonged to people who still had time to spare. She almost missed her chance to catch him at all. It was 1:14 a.m. when the elevator groaned again, and this time there was no 15-minute gap between the sound of his footsteps and her recognition of them. She knew the rhythm now, the way you know a threat once you finally let yourself name it as one. Claire was at the nurse's station, notebook closed, phone already in her scrub pocket, with the hospital's security line saved under a name that wouldn't raise questions if anyone glanced at her screen. She did not go to the supply closet this time. She went to the doorway of 214 itself, and stood just outside it, in the shadow the hallway light didn't quite reach. Whitfield entered without hesitation. That was the detail that would stay with her longest. Afterward. Not the syringe, not even what came next, but the sheer, practiced ease of a man walking into a room at 1 a.m. as if he owned every minute of it. He didn't check the hallway this time. He didn't need to. 3 weeks of no consequences had taught him that no one was watching closely enough to matter. Dagger was already moving before Whitfield's second foot cleared the doorframe. The growl came low first, a sound with weight to it, rising out of the dark corner where he'd been lying with his head on his paws, in the specific, deceptive stillness of an animal that had learned to look asleep while remaining entirely awake. By the time Whitfield reached the IV pole, Dagger was standing. By the time Whitfield's hand closed around the port, Dagger had crossed the room. Easy, Rowan's voice, thick with the particular fog Claire now understood wasn't fatigue at all, surfaced from somewhere near sleep, and didn't finish the word. Claire stopped breathing. She watched Whitfield's hand move, watched the syringe catch what little light the room held, a thin, dark line of liquid inside it that did not match, in color or in volume, anything she had seen accompany a routine painkiller in 3 weeks of watching this exact procedure performed correctly by every other nurse on this floor. He angled it toward the port. His thumb found the plunger. Dagger did not bark. He did not lunge with wild, uncontrolled aggression the way Claire had half expected, half feared, some nightmare version of a dog finally breaking. He moved instead with the terrible precision of an animal that had once been trained for exactly this. A single, controlled surge that put his full weight between the syringe and the port. Teeth bared inches from Whitfield's wrist. A sound tearing out of his chest that filled the small room end to end and left no space in it for anything else. Whitfield froze. For 1 full second, the syringe hung motionless in the air between his hand and the line, and Claire watched him make a decision, not to retreat, not yet, but to try, one more time, to finish what he'd started. That was the second she moved. She did not call out, did not give him the half-breath of warning a shout would have offered. She crossed the threshold of 214 in 3 steps, closed the distance to the IV pole before her own mind had finished deciding to run, and closed her hand around Whitfield's wrist with a grip that surprised her with its own strength. Don't. One word. Flat. Final. Whitfield's head snapped toward her, and for the first time in 3 weeks, she saw his face without any of its careful, practiced calm. Saw, instead, the raw, unguarded arithmetic of a man realizing, in real time, that every version of tonight he'd planned for had just collapsed at once. "You don't know what you're— I know exactly what I'm looking at." Her voice did not shake. She would be surprised by that, later, replaying it. In the moment, there was no room for surprise. Only the syringe, still hovering between them. Dagger's growl, a solid wall of sound at her side. Rowan, struggling upright against pillows he couldn't fully see. His hand reaching blind toward the sound of his son's dog defending him. Whitfield's grip on the syringe tightened. For half a second, Claire genuinely did not know which way the next moment would break. Then she reached past him, without releasing his wrist, and pressed the flat, silent alarm button mounted beside the headboard, the one meant for exactly this, for the moments too dangerous for a shout, the one Priya had shown her on her first week and she had never once expected to use. No siren sounded, no lights flashed. The alarm did its work in total silence, exactly as designed, a signal traveling down through the building's wiring, toward a security desk 2 floors below, while the room itself remained frozen in place. Whitfield's wrist locked in her grip, Dagger's teeth an inch from flesh. Rowan calling his son's dog's name into the dark with the raw, uncomprehending panic of a man who could hear a war starting in his own hospital room and could do nothing but listen. "It's over," Claire said, quiet, certain, not releasing his wrist for 1 second. "It's over, Marcus." Somewhere below them, she knew, security had already begun to move. Security arrived in under 90 seconds, which felt, to Claire, like both an eternity and no time at all. Long enough for Whitfield to stop struggling against her grip once the first uniformed officer appeared in the doorway. Short enough that the syringe was still recognizably a threat when it was finally pried from his fingers and sealed, with gloved and careful hands, into an evidence bag. Dagger did not stand down until the second officer had Whitfield's wrists cuffed behind his back. Even then, he held his position at the foot of the bed, a low, continuous rumble still threading through his chest, as if some part of him understood that vigilance, once given up too early, was the exact mistake that had cost him everything the first time. The questions came fast after that, the way they always do once the emergency itself has passed, and the bureaucracy of understanding what happened begins. Dr. Ferris summoned from home, hospital administration filling the hallway in a cluster of pale, urgent faces. A detective named Alvarez, arriving within the hour, with a notebook that looked disconcertingly like Claire's own. But the full shape of it, the part that would keep Claire awake long after the immediate danger had passed, didn't surface until 3 days later, when Detective Alvarez sat across from her in a small consultation room and laid out, piece by piece, what a forensic review of Whitfield's phone and bank records had uncovered. He wasn't hired by anyone connected to the hospital, Alvarez said, sliding a folder across the table that Claire didn't fully understand her right to look at and didn't ask. Payments started 8 weeks ago, routed through 2 shell accounts before they landed anywhere near him, which tells you the people paying him know exactly what they're doing. He tapped a printed page, a list of transfers, dates that Claire recognized with a small, cold jolt. They lined up almost exactly with the timeline in her own notebook. Private contractor, corporate security firm, on paper. Off paper, they do a lot of work for clients who'd rather certain things never make it to a courtroom. Claire sat very still. What courtroom? Alvarez's expression didn't change, but something in his voice slowed, the particular care of a man delivering information he knew would land harder than its own words suggested. Sergeant Voss was set to give a deposition. Sworn testimony, scheduled for 6 weeks from now, regarding an incident that occurred during his last deployment. A private security detail, operating alongside his unit, contracted by the same firm we just traced these payments to. There were casualties. Voss was the only surviving witness in a position to describe, under oath, exactly whose decisions led to them. The room went very quiet. Claire thought of Rowan's dry, careful humor, his hand finding the edge of the mattress instead of a ghost leash he no longer needed, the specific, exhausting patience of a man rebuilding a life out of the wreckage of one that no longer existed. She had assumed, she realized now, sitting in this small gray room, that whatever was happening to him was random, opportunistic, the ordinary cruelty of a broken system exploited by a broken man. She had not imagined it as a plan, deliberate, funded, timed. They didn't want him dead, Alvarez continued, watching her absorb it. Dead raises questions. Dead gets investigated. What they wanted was simpler and a lot harder to prove. A slow deterioration, enough sedation, spread out carefully enough that by the time his deposition date arrived, his own physicians would be the ones recommending it get postponed. Cognitive fog. Unreliable memory. A witness nobody would want to put on the stand. Not because he was lying, but because he genuinely couldn't be trusted to remember clearly anymore. He closed the folder. Whitfield didn't need to hurt him in any way that would show up on an autopsy report, Ms. Bennett. He just needed to buy enough delay that the deposition became worthless, and he very nearly managed it. Claire thought of the notebook in her pocket, the small, careful record of an 11% gap she had almost convinced herself was nothing. She thought of a boy pressing his mouth to her ear every afternoon for 3 weeks, trying to hand a grown-up something he had no language yet to fully explain, because the thing he'd actually witnessed, a hallway conversation overheard once, a dosage administered while his father drifted in and out, some fragment a child's mind had correctly registered as wrong long before any adult's paperwork caught up to it, had no name a boy that age could put to it, except the truest one available. He hurts Dad when you leave. The dog, she said, after a moment, because it was the only piece left that still didn't fit anywhere official. How did the dog know? Alvarez almost smiled, the closest thing to warmth she'd see from him all day. Off the record, I've worked with enough canine units to have a theory, for whatever it's worth. Animals like that are trained for years to read exactly the kind of thing Whitfield was trying to hide. Controlled movement, elevated stress hormones, someone approaching a target with intent instead of routine. We spend our whole lives learning to lie to each other with words. Nobody ever taught that dog to believe them. He closed his notebook. For what it's worth, Miss Bennett, the department's going to want a statement about tonight. But I think you already know you didn't need us to tell you something was wrong. You had a boy and a dog, and about 2 weeks of your own notes that got there faster than any of us did. Claire didn't answer right away. She was thinking of Rowan, 3 floors up, sleeping without fog for the first time in weeks, and of Ethan, who did not yet know the full shape of what he'd prevented, only that his father was safe, and Dagger had been brave, and Miss Claire had, somehow, made everything all right. The whole enormous, adult machinery of contracts and cover-ups and sworn testimony reduced, in an 8-year-old's understanding, to the simplest and most accurate sentence, available, the bad thing stopped. She found, sitting in that gray little room with the folder closed on the table between them, that she couldn't entirely disagree with him. The fog lifted slowly, the way a tide goes out rather than the way a light switches on, and Rowan spent the better part of a week simply relearning what his own mind felt like without something working against it. He hadn't understood, until it was gone, how much of the last month he'd spent underwater, how many conversations he'd half followed, how many afternoons had dissolved into a gray blur he'd blamed, quietly and without complaint, on his own broken body, rather than on anything being done to it. Waking up clear-headed for the first time in weeks felt less like recovery and more like being handed back a version of himself he'd assumed was permanently misplaced. Dr. Ferris came by twice a day now, instead of once, apologetic in a way that bordered on painful, running through Rowan's chart aloud, as if saying it out loud enough times might undo the fact that it had happened on her watch. Rowan let her apologize. He understood, better than most people ever would, how systems failed quietly and how it rarely felt like anyone's fault in the moment it was happening. You simply followed the procedure in front of you, trusted the person whose job it was to be trusted, and by the time the gap revealed itself, the damage had already accumulated past the point where blame did anyone much good. He'd spent a career inside institutions that worked exactly that way, for better and for worse. What he wanted, more than an apology, was the full shape of what had actually happened to him. And it was Ethan, in the end, who gave it to him first, before any detective's report or hospital debrief managed to catch up. The boy climbed onto the bed rail that Saturday afternoon with the particular seriousness of someone who had been rehearsing what he wanted to say, and instead of his usual scattershot narration of crayons eaten on dares and green beans served twice in 1 week, he sat very still for a moment, hands folded in his lap, and said, "I knew something was wrong before anybody believed me." Rowan turned his face toward his son's voice, giving it the full weight of his attention, the way he'd learned to give everything now, that sight no longer did that work for him automatically. "I know you did, Bud. I saw him one time, through the door crack, when I came back for my jacket." Ethan's voice had the careful, deliberate cadence of a child choosing each word with more caution than usual, testing whether the memory was safe to hand over whole. He looked out at the hallway 2 times before he did anything, like he was checking. Regular doctors don't check like that. "No," Rowan said quietly. "They don't. I told Miss Claire every day. I didn't know how to say it right at first." A small, apologetic shrug, the specific self-consciousness of a child worried he'd failed at something important by not explaining it well enough the first time. But Dagger knew right away. He always knew before I did. Rowan reached toward the sound of his son's voice until his hand found the boy's shoulder, small and warm and solid under his palm, and something in his chest, the thing that had been clenched tight since the explosion, since the first morning he'd woken into permanent dark and understood exactly how much of himself he'd have to rebuild from nothing, loosened by one more careful degree. "You did say it right," he said. "You said it exactly right. It just took the grown-ups a little while to catch up to you." From the corner of the room came the soft, familiar sound of Dagger shifting his weight, settling more fully into the patch of afternoon light through the window, rather than the tense, coiled readiness he'd held for 3 straight weeks. Rowan noticed the change before he could have named what caused it. Some shift in the room's air, the particular quality of a body, finally allowing itself to rest because the thing it had been guarding against no longer walked these halls. He held his hand out, and after a moment, felt the familiar weight of a broad, scarred head settle beneath his palm. Unprompted, unasked. The same gesture Dagger had offered maybe a dozen times in 3 weeks, and never with quite this much unhurried ease. "You knew," Rowan murmured, scratching gently behind one ear. "The whole time." "Didn't you?" Dagger exhaled, long and low, and pressed his head more fully into Rowan's hand. Not a dramatic gesture, not the kind of thing a film would linger on, just the small, ordinary weight of an animal finally allowing himself to be still in a room he'd spent weeks unable to trust. Rowan thought of the years before the injury, The years he could actually still see, when trusting Dagger's instincts over his own eyes, had saved his life more than once, in places far more dangerous than a hospital corridor. He had forgotten, somewhere in the fog of the last 11 months, that the trust had always run both directions, that the dog beside him wasn't simply something to be protected and pitied, a scarred animal nobody else wanted, but a partner who had never once stopped doing the only job he'd ever known, watching over the people who couldn't watch over themselves. "I owe you," Rowan said, "to the dog, to the room, to no one in particular," his voice rougher than he meant it to be. "I owe you both." Ethan, still perched on the bed rail, grinned the specific, unguarded grin of a child whose father was finally, actually getting better, and said, with the easy confidence of someone who had never once doubted how this would end, "Dagger says you don't owe him anything. He says that's just what partners do." Rowan laughed, a real laugh, the first one in longer than he could easily count, low and warm and entirely unclouded. And for the first time since the explosion had taken his sight and left him this permanent gray static instead, he felt something that had nothing to do with vision at all. The clear, unmistakable sense of finally seeing, in every way that actually mattered, exactly who had been standing beside him the whole time. Discharge day arrived 3 weeks later, on a morning bright enough that even Rowan's damaged eyes could register it as something more than gray static. A wash of warmer light against the dark, the closest thing to sunrise his world offered anymore, and he'd take it. He sat on the edge of the hospital bed in street clothes for the first time in what felt like a different lifetime, wading through the last of the discharge paperwork, one hand resting on Dagger's head out of habit now rather than necessity, and found himself unexpectedly, absurdly nervous, the way you're nervous stepping back into a life you're no longer entirely sure how to fit into. Ethan arrived before the paperwork was finished, which surprised no one. He came through the door at a dead run, backpack forgotten in his mother's arms somewhere behind him, and didn't stop until he'd collided full force into his father's chest, arms wrapping around him with the specific, desperate strength of a child who had spent weeks being brave in small, quiet increments and had finally been given permission to stop. "You're coming home," Ethan said, muffled against his father's shirt, not quite a question. "I'm coming home." Rowan's arms closed around his son, and he pressed his face into the boy's hair, breathing in the ordinary, unremarkable smell of shampoo and playground dust, a smell that had never once, in 11 months of darkness, meant more than it did in that exact second. "Because of you, bud. You know that, right? None of this happens without you." Ethan pulled back just far enough to look up at him, eyes bright and serious, in the way only a child's can be when they've decided a moment matters enough to hold still for it. "I was scared to tell you," he admitted. "I thought you'd say I was making it up. Grown-ups say that sometimes." "I would never say that." Rowan's voice caught, just slightly, on the words. "Not to you. Not ever. I told Dagger first." Ethan turned, one arm still looped around his father's middle, and reached the other hand out toward the dog, who had risen without being called and pressed himself into the small space between them both, tail moving now with an easy, unhurried rhythm that would have been unthinkable in this room a month ago. "He believed me before anybody did." Rowan reached down with his free hand and found the familiar shape of Dagger's head, scarred flank pressed warm against his knee, and for a moment the three of them simply stayed like that. A boy, a dog, a man who had needed both of them far more than he'd ever managed to say out loud, while morning light moved slowly across a hospital room that no longer felt like a place anything had been taken from him. Claire appeared in the doorway partway through it, clipboard forgotten at her side, and made no move to interrupt. She had seen 100 discharges in 9 years of nursing, the ordinary relief of families reunited after illness, and had learned to feel real, unguarded happiness for every one of them, without ever quite letting it land as deeply as this one did. This one she let land. She stood in the doorway and watched a boy who had spent 3 weeks whispering a truth no one wanted to hear, finally get to stop carrying it alone. Watched a scarred, discarded working dog get to be, for the first time in longer than anyone could guess, simply loved rather than merely tolerated, and felt something in her own chest loosen that she hadn't fully realized she'd been holding tight since the night she pressed a silent alarm and didn't know, in that half-second, whether help would arrive in time. "Ready, Sergeant?" she asked finally, when the moment had settled enough to hold words again. Rowan lifted his face toward her voice, and though his eyes would never again show her exactly what he felt, his smile did the work well enough. "Ready." Ethan took his father's hand on one side. Dagger fell into step on the other, close against Rowan's leg. No leash between them anymore because none had ever really been the thing holding them together in the first place. And the three of them walked out of room 214 into a hallway full of ordinary morning light. A boy, a dog, and a soldier who had come home from the wrong war twice now and been saved, both times, by the two smallest and most overlooked members of his own family. Claire watched them go until the elevator doors closed and then went back to her rounds, notebook still tucked in her scrub pocket, carrying nothing in it now but the ordinary weight of a job well done. We tell ourselves that courage looks a certain way, that it wears a uniform or carries a weapon or announces itself in the exact moment danger arrives, loud and unmistakable, the way it does in the stories we grew up believing. But courage, more often than not, is quieter than that. It doesn't announce itself at all. It simply shows up, again and again, in rooms nobody is watching, and does the smaller, harder thing, when the easier thing would have gone entirely unnoticed. Nobody would have blamed Claire Bennett for looking away. The chart said everything was normal. Her supervisors would have believed the chart. She had a career to protect, a schedule that didn't require her to trade a Friday night for a stranger's suspicion. 100 reasonable arguments lined up on the side of doing nothing at all. She chose to stay anyway, not because she had proof, not yet, but because she had a feeling she refused to talk herself out of. And the willingness to be wrong in public is very often the only thing standing between a quiet tragedy and a quiet rescue. Nobody would have blamed an 8-year-old boy for staying silent either. Ethan had no evidence, no vocabulary for what he'd witnessed, no reason to believe an adult would take a whispered 5 words more seriously than a nightmare. Children learn early how often their fears get folded into the category of imagination, dismissed with a kind hand on the head and a go back to sleep, sweetheart. He kept saying it anyway, every single day, for weeks, in case this was finally the day someone listened. That is not a small thing. That is one of the bravest things a person can do at any age, to keep telling the truth to a world that has not yet learned to hear it. And nobody taught Dagger to protect a man who could no longer see the threat standing over him. Nobody trained him for this particular room, this particular danger, this particular quiet act of guarding a broken body through the fog of drugged, dreamless nights. He had already been failed once, discarded, mislabeled, treated as a liability rather than what he actually was. He would have been forgiven for deciding trust wasn't worth the risk anymore, for retreating fully into the guarded stillness 11 months of neglect had taught him. He chose, instead, to stand between danger and the man he loved, night after night, asking nothing in return but the chance to keep doing it. That is the thread that runs underneath every part of this story, if you look for it. None of them acted because it was easy. None of them had certainty on their side. Not at the beginning, not even close. What they had was something smaller and more stubborn than certainty. A refusal to let the people and the animals who cannot always speak for themselves go unheard and unprotected, even when speaking up costs something real. We like to imagine that if we were ever in Claire's position, we would notice. That if we were Ethan, we would find the courage to keep saying the hard thing until someone finally listened. That if we were Dagger, scarred and discarded and given every reason to stop trusting the world, we would still choose, somehow, to guard the door one more time. The truth is that most of us don't know which one of them we'd actually be, until the moment arrives and asks something of us we didn't know we had. Maybe that's the real gift in a story like this one. Not the reminder that heroes exist, but the reminder that heroism, most of the time, doesn't look like anything special at all. It looks like a nurse who stayed 1 hour later than she had to. A boy who kept whispering the truth until someone finally leaned down to listen. A dog who had every reason to stop trusting anyone and chose, instead, to trust one more time. Because somewhere, in a language none of us fully understand, loyalty had already made the decision that love was always going to be worth the risk.